Dear brothers and sisters, Namo Buddhaya, Jai Bhim, Jai Urgyen. To me, Bhante, since his death, has become Urgyen, fully. And I'm sure, like many of you, Bhante has had a huge impact. He's had the major influence on my life. Mahamachi told you that I first met Bhante 49 years ago. Actually, I saw him for the first time 50 years ago, almost to the day. I saw him just walking along past Hampstead Heath. I had no idea who he was, but the image of his mindful, self-possessed presence is indelibly imprinted on my mind. I can see it right now. And it was only later that I realised the person I was learning meditation from was the one I'd seen so much earlier, or somewhat earlier. I did see him in Hyde Park at a Rolling Stones concert, but he denies it. Since Bhante's died, I've sort of realised more fully the impact that he's had on me. I feel he's in every breath I take. I feel he's in the flow of my blood. I feel he's in the beat of my heart. And his presence is at the back of my mind, sometimes right at the front of my mind, all the time. And always has been. But since there's no physical locus for his presence, I've realised, in a way, who he really is. Freed from the specificity of a body, he's become something vast and limitless. That presence has not always been a comfortable one, I have to say. Certainly for me, and perhaps for some others too. Bhante is not a comfortable and convenient teacher, as we all know. He's left us with some wonderful paradoxes and dilemmas. Perhaps gurus should never be comfortable and convenient, but he certainly wasn't. Uncompromising, unconventional, and sometimes outrageous. And I wouldn't have it any other way. He's, of course, a human being with a particular character. And that character, that human personality, has led to things that I certainly found difficult to come to terms with. But nevertheless, always, and even more now, I've experienced the shining light of the Dharma through him, penetrating deeply inside me, and which I will never, ever be losing. It can't lose it. It's so much part of me. And I'm sure that in various ways this is very much the same for many of you, that Bhante will have affected your life, turned it upside down, inside out, and you'll never be the same after that encounter, I hope. Bhante himself is very aware of his own limitations. He famously said that he was not really the right person to start a new Buddhist movement. He had so many limitations. In a way, any being has to occupy space and time, and whatever's in space and time has to be specific. It can't be everything. And if it's one thing, it can't be another. So, by definition, any teacher has to be something very definite and therefore not something else, and cannot encompass the whole field. And this is the sort of paradox of the Bodhisattva. And I believe Bhante is a Bodhisattva. I'm convinced Bhante is a Bodhisattva. Of what level, what stage, I've no idea. That's beyond me, and I don't really care. It's really only the Buddha in whom there's a perfect consonance between transcendental realization and spatio-temporal manifestation. That's what the Bodhisattva does, lifetime by lifetime by lifetime. the Bodhisattva prepares him or herself by practicing the paramitas so that they develop a perfect body of wisdom and punya, so that when they manifest in their own Buddha field, they are perfect. But up until that point, the Bodhisattva is always, as I say, specific, doesn't cover the whole field, maybe has flaws, maybe has blind spots or whatever. But always the Bodhisattva is in touch with something transcendent. And it's that transcendent dimension that drives the Bodhisattva. So yes, I believe that though Bhante himself considered himself to be limited in certain ways as a founder, maybe just by virtue of being, as he says, interested in the humanities rather than science, maybe in other ways. Nonetheless, he was deeply imbued with the spirit of the Dhamma, which shone through him upon so many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. In India, you see, sometimes I've certainly myself addressed crowds of 30,000, and Bhante himself addressed so many hundreds of thousands of people, all of whom caught that shining light of, a glimmer of that shining light of the Dhamma coming from him. And so many people in the future will catch that, even though they never meet the man. His influence will live on. So that's the paradox of the Bodhisattva, and we must keep focusing on what the Bodhisattva is attempting to body forth, and that Bhante so skillfully actually has bodied forth. Look at us. We are the sons and daughters of Sangharakshita. I keep thinking I'm in India. Yes, we're Bhante's sons and daughters, born of his mouth, as the Buddha says, of himself. And we are trying to continue the Bodhisattva activity that Bhante began so wonderfully. So Bhante says that he was not the ideal person to start a new Buddhist movement. The new Buddhist movement had to be started in 1967. And it's worth us just reflecting why that is the case. It's difficult to sort of realise it now because the world has changed so much in the last 50 years. It's a very, very different world in so many ways. But in 1967, when Bhante felt himself constrained to start a new Buddhist movement, the scene for Buddhism was not very promising. He started in London in the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara and working at the Buddhist Society, and by his own account and something of my own experience, it was not a very dynamic or attractive setup. Buddhism was still primarily an upper middle class preserve. It was still predominantly intellectual in its appeal, and its sort of profile was conventional, you might say. Bhante was, for instance, told by one of the leaders that he should consider himself the Buddhist vicar of Hampstead. If anything, if Bhante is not anything, it's not a vicar. Nothing against vicars, of course, but Bhante isn't one. It wasn't very promising. Lot of sectarianism, even though there were a few dozen Buddhists that are already polarizing into sects. A wonderful faculty that we had as human beings to polarize. He'd been working in India and very closely identified with the movement of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar and considered himself to be taking that movement onto his own shoulders at Babasaheb's death. But he found it more and more difficult to work because the movement was essentially getting more and more bogged down in politics, both politics as its idea, as its perspective, so to speak, but also internal politics. For instance, he found that when he was in Pune, he couldn't get the different Buddhist groups to agree to arrange his program. So he relied on the Pune District Women's Association, which was run by later Dhammacharini Dhammalochana, whose daughter is here today. Where is she? Ashmita. So Bhante felt increasingly cramped by the environment of Buddhism in India, even though he was deeply inspired and felt a strong connection with the generality of the new Buddhists. He wanted to help. It was increasingly difficult for him to do so. So, not very promising there either. The situation for Buddhism generally was not very bright. Buddhism has been in the 20th century in its worst period of decline ever. We only have to think that the Chinese invaded and really pretty thoroughly tried to stamp out Buddhism in Tibet from 1956 or so onwards. Of course, they didn't succeed, but they certainly broke it as an essential part of the local culture, of the broader culture. In many other countries, Buddhism has been in retreat from communism, and more recently from the universal and most effective religion the world has ever known, consumerism. Materialism has really pushed back at Buddhism. And Buddhism has not responded yet, as a whole, all that well. There are very bright spots, and there are certain groups and individuals who very much kept the Dhamma alive. But as a whole, Buddhism has been in decline. Bhante saw this very, very clearly and saw that what was needed was a completely new start. For one thing, Bhante was very aware of the broad spread of Buddhism. And he, from the start, I think at the age of 18, he gave a talk at the Buddhist Society called The Unity of Buddhism. So for him, Buddhism was a whole. You couldn't align yourself with any one particular school. You had to identify with the whole of Buddhism and draw on whatever was valuable in that in order to try to re-express the Dhamma in the modern situation. And that's what he set out to do. And for all his saying he wasn't the ideal person, he was certainly good enough. And here we are to prove it. He was certainly good enough. Even though he's left us a few very nice little conundrums and difficulties which keep us on our toes. He's been a good enough guru with sometimes absolutely impeccable instinct. Nothing, for instance, demonstrates that instinct as his choice of when to die. He might have chosen better weather, but in every other way, he's chosen the absolutely perfect moment. When it almost passes, well, we deeply mourn him, but we're not worried. We're not bothered. We know that Bhante's done his work. We've taken into us the task that he's given us. We're well accustomed to taking the responsibility. 18 years since he handed on his responsibilities as head of the order. He timed impeccably. And he died just before the public preceptors were meeting so that we could, well, I think they had a brief discussion. I'm no longer I'm a retired public preceptor. They had a brief discussion of what after Bhante. So they all said, why are we talking about this? We just carry on. It's all going on. Bhante's timing is impeccable. And it's important that we, at this point in having a very pure experience of Bhante, because we're freed from his spatio-temporal existence, to sort of dwell a little bit upon what it is that is left. Something transcendent, something that can't be caught in the net of words. He himself says that he does not consider that he founded the order and the movement. It was founded through him by what he talked about at some points as a supra-personal force. At another point he said that there's a vast overshadowing consciousness that founded the order through him. And it's that vast overshadowing consciousness that I believe he has now as it were, become identified with. He's fully part of that and fully continues. He will continue to function in the future in whatever way we do not know. I had an extraordinary conversation with him about 6 years ago when we were still in Birmingham, Majamaloka. It took my breath away, like sometimes happens with Bhante. I went to see him and he said he wanted to die. He was ready to die. He said he found this life disgusting, was the word he used. I think we must be careful how we understand that. I understand it as nibbida or nirveda, for those of you who are dharmically knowledgeable. This sort of sense of not wanting to be attached to the world. So he said he felt a sort of disgust with the world, and he wanted peace, he wanted a rest. He looked forward to a rest when he died. Oh, Bhante, you've got it now. And may you deeply enjoy it. He wanted to die so that he could rest from his labours. And it's extraordinary that he actually kept going. And I think he kept going because he wanted this place to be established so that something stood there as a focus for the future. And it was a tremendous strain for him to move here. When you're 80, 88, to move is very difficult. It's most old people die when they have to move. But he took it. He did it because it needed doing. And yes, he said, yes, I find this life disgusting. I don't really want to continue it. And he said, but I do believe in rebirth. There is rebirth. I believe in it. And he said that, and there is the Bodhisattva vow. So I'm sure that I will be reborn. I, of course, asked him where and when, because you would have blamed me if I hadn't. But he wasn't going to be drawn on that one. Very sensibly. I think he thinks he's quite capable of sorting things out for himself without our help. But I think Bhante will be back. We may not know it. We may not know that he's here. But that spirit that carried him along through this life, into this life, that founded this order, will continue, is continuing, and we can continue in contact with it. He himself was deeply connected to that spirit, and he's completely identified with it now, and we simply need to think of him, as Mahamati suggested, and we will be in contact with that essential spirit that now permeates the whole order and the whole movement, and that will flow out more and more fully into the world. Thank you.